So I think definitely the biggest trend is digging deeper. We're seeing a whole host of organizations, both companies and banks, really stepping up their compliance programs and really starting to use more in-depth due diligence to comply with some of the regulations. So one important example around that is the whole concept of ultimate beneficial ownership. So banks who may be traditionally contracted with corporate entities and did a certain level of due diligence to understand the reputation of that entity are now really digging much further to understand who owns the entity ultimately. And oftentimes that research process can be quite challenging, particularly around privately held companies. There's a whole host of documents that need to be pulled and sort of ownership chains that they really need to follow. But this is something that we've seen particularly around Russian sanctions, is really understanding if you have a sanctioned individual, what companies does he or she own? Well, I think traditionally the sort of US and the UK anti-bribery and corruption legislation, so in the US it would be the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, here in the UK it's the UK Bribery Act. Those have always been seen as kind of the pillars of transnational legislation around the compliance world. And what they really say is that while they do target entities that are domiciled in the US and in the UK, they extend the legislative reach to cover also organizations that have a footprint in either of those in either of those countries, or also that transact in the currencies of those jurisdictions. So for example, you might have a company in Germany, or you might have a company in South Korea that has a presence in the US or transacts in sterling, which many multinational organizations would. They all of a sudden become liable under some of the legislative and regulatory environment of these acts. I think, and we've seen particularly in the US, the Department of Justice has been very stringent on placing enforcement action on foreign companies more so than on US companies. So it's certainly a reality that a lot of multinational organizations have to live by. Well, I think obviously any corporation entering a new market needs to be aware of what the local laws and regulations are around any sort of business practice. We've seen particularly in the Middle East over the last couple of years a lot of sort of local accounting standards that have come out that are affecting the way that some companies supply with contract with local suppliers. We've also seen around particular legislation around sort of labor practices that are affecting the supply chain in terms of, something that might be acceptable in one jurisdiction may not be acceptable in another. And I think a lot of corporations are really trying to find an international standard that they can abide by, but they have to tweak it based on local requirements. Another thing that we're seeing quite frequently in the compliance space is that a lot of countries are adopting their own definitions around politically exposed individuals, which is a main component of anti-money laundering screening. So while you have a lot of banks that have a global definition, they're often having to tweak that depending on the local markets where they're operating. Here at Thomson Reuters, we do several things to help companies comply with their supply chain risk management. One is the development of data sets that can be used for screening. So everything from companies and individuals that are sanctioned, companies and individuals that are high risk, companies and individuals that are involved in financial crime. So really providing data that companies themselves can screen their supply chain through to highlight any risks. And then if something were to be found, they would take appropriate steps to mitigate against those risks. We also have some managed services around that type of screening. So companies can outsource the screening to us against our own data. And we also have an enhanced due diligence proposition, which is really more of a bespoke research type of service where companies can give us potentially medium risk suppliers, and analysts will go out and do a background search and really understand what the reputation is of that company. We're kind of pooling all these assets together at the moment to develop, kind of know your third party supplier type of proposition, which will really kind of help corporations understand how to get these programs started, what assets they need, and really some creative tools for them not only to do screening, but also to start to understand what that supplier web is, and if they do have individuals or companies that they have some concern about, is understand really where that web is and what the relationship is behind some of these individuals.